It was a cool morning in London. The sky was a soft gray, and the sound of footsteps echoed across the cobbled street in front of Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered near the gates, holding up their phones and taking pictures of the royal guards. The guards stood perfectly still, their red uniforms bright against the dull sky. They didn't move, blink, or speak. To many, they looked more like statues than people. Colonel Eric Dawson stepped out of a sleek black car parked nearby. He wore a long navy coat with gold buttons, and his polished shoes clicked on the pavement as he walked. Eric was a senior officer from a foreign embassy, visiting the UK on official duty. This was his first time at the palace. He had heard stories about the royal guards but had never seen one in person. He stopped in front of one of the guards. The guard stood tall, eyes fixed forward, hands gripping his rifle. Eric watched him for a moment, clearly unimpressed. The colonel came from a military culture where rank meant everything. Salutes were expected, especially when someone of high position walked by. He believed it was a sign of respect, not just a rule. Eric turned to one of his aides and said loudly, "Watch this." He took a step closer to the guard. The crowd around the gates quieted slightly, sensing something was about to happen. "Soldier," Eric said firmly, "salute your superior." The words hung in the air. A few tourists glanced at each other. Some lowered their phones, unsure whether they were about to witness a serious moment or just a misunderstanding. But the guard did not move, not even a flicker of his eyes. He stared straight ahead, expression calm and blank. The wind rustled the edge of his uniform, but he remained still as stone. Eric tilted his head. He repeated the command. "I said salute." Again, no response. Now whispers began to spread among the crowd. People were watching closely. Some had started recording the moment on their phones. The silence between the officer and the guard was growing longer, heavier. One of Eric's aides stepped forward and whispered, "Sir, they don't respond. It's not personal. It's protocol." Eric waved him off, clearly annoyed. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his own country, a guard would never fail to respond to someone of his rank. To him, this felt like disrespect. Still, the guard stood motionless. Finally, Eric gave a short, sharp sigh and turned away. He muttered something under his breath, clearly unhappy. The guard never moved. Not a blink, not a word. But as Eric walked off, the tension in the air stayed behind. No one could have guessed that this small moment at the gates of the palace would soon turn into something much bigger. Something that would shake the embassy. Colonel Eric Dawson sat in the back seat of his car as it rolled through the quiet London streets. He stared out the window, his jaw tight. The moment with the guards still bothered him. He felt embarrassed, though he didn't want to admit it. The way the guard ignored him, stood there like a wall, it felt like a challenge, and Colonel Dawson didn't like being challenged. His aide, Martin, sat across from him. Martin looked nervous, but tried to speak calmly. "Sir, with all respect, the royal guards are trained not to react. They're not allowed to speak or move unless there's a real threat." Eric didn't respond. He only gave a small grunt and kept his eyes on the passing buildings. Back at the foreign embassy, the staff was already talking. Word about the event at Buckingham Palace had spread quickly. Someone had posted a short video online. It showed Colonel Dawson standing in front of the guard, giving the order to salute, and it showed the guard doing nothing at all. Within an hour, the clip had thousands of views. Some of the embassy workers watched it on their phones, sharing quiet comments and unsure laughs. No one dared say much while the colonel was around, but behind closed doors, the story was moving fast. In the media room of the embassy, a junior officer named Sam looked up from his screen. "It's going viral," he said to his colleague. "They're calling it the salute that never came." Meanwhile, Eric arrived at the embassy. He walked through the entrance with his usual confident steps, but the mood in the building felt different, quieter. Staff members nodded at him but quickly looked away. Eric could feel the shift, even if no one said a word. He went straight to his office and closed the door. For a moment, he just stood there. He knew people were talking. He knew the video was out. But he also felt something else, something more personal. He had tried to show power, and it had backfired. Inside the British embassy across town, a different conversation was happening. Officials were aware of the situation. They had seen the video too. But instead of anger, they were more focused on what it meant for future visits. They didn't want trouble. They wanted to remind everyone about the rules of engagement with the Queen's Guard. A letter was written that afternoon. It was polite but clear. It explained the role of the royal guards and the importance of respecting their duties. The letter was prepared to be delivered to Colonel Dawson the next day. Outside, the weather had turned colder. The sky was still gray, and the quiet hum of London carried on. But inside the walls of two embassies, the air felt heavier. The moment at the gates was no longer just a misunderstanding. It had started to grow into something more serious, and it was far from over. The next morning, Colonel Eric Dawson sat at his desk, staring at the letter in front of him. It had come just after breakfast, sealed with the royal crest. He knew exactly what it was about, and he wasn't happy about it. He read it again, slowly this time. The letter was polite, but it was clear. It explained that the royal guards at Buckingham Palace were not allowed to salute anyone unless it was a formal military ceremony or a direct command from the Queen. They stood as part of a tradition, serving the crown and not individuals. The letter also gently reminded him that it was important to respect these traditions while on British soil. Eric put the letter down and rubbed his forehead. He had known that the British had their rules, but he had never expected this level of formality. To him, the salute had been an obvious sign of respect, something that could not be ignored. But in this case, the silence of the guard had carried its own message. His aide, Martin, walked into the room, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Sir, the media is still buzzing about yesterday. They're calling it an international standoff now. It's getting more attention than we thought." Eric sighed deeply. He didn't like the idea of his actions being turned into a public spectacle. "We need to fix this," he muttered. Outside the office, the rest of the staff was discussing the situation too. Some of them had been laughing about it, but the laughter had faded when they realized how serious the situation had become. The video was everywhere. People from all over the world had seen it. Some were amused by the unusual scene at the palace gates, while others were criticizing Eric for not understanding British customs. In the royal palace, the situation was also being discussed. The Queen's staff had seen the video, but they weren't worried. The guards were trained for moments like these. The palace had always stood firm in its traditions, and nothing was going to change that. But the palace also understood the importance of diplomacy. They knew that the letter had to be sent, and it was important that it was done with care. As the day went on, the media coverage only grew. News stations picked up the story, showing clips of the silent guard and the foreign officer who had demanded a salute. Some reporters even suggested that the situation could harm relations between the two countries, but most people saw it as a funny misunderstanding. Back at the embassy, Eric was meeting with his ambassador. "Sir," the ambassador began, "I think it's time to issue a public statement, something simple and respectful. We can't let this get out of hand." Eric didn't like the idea of issuing an apology, but he knew the right thing to do was to smooth things over. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "I'll write something. We'll handle this quietly." He spent the rest of the afternoon drafting the statement. It was careful, respectful, and acknowledged the misunderstanding without making excuses. He knew that his reputation was at stake, but he also knew that sometimes pride had to be put aside for the sake of diplomacy. As he signed the letter, Eric couldn't help but think about the silent guard standing by the gates of Buckingham Palace. The guard had been unmoved, not by disrespect, but by the strength of tradition. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to learn from that silence. The next day, as the morning fog began to lift from the streets of London, Colonel Eric Dawson prepared to address the media. He stood in front of a camera in the embassy's press room, wearing his usual serious expression. A few reporters gathered around, their cameras focused on him. They had been waiting for his statement all morning. Eric cleared his throat and began speaking. "Yesterday, there was a misunderstanding between myself and a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. I would like to apologize if my actions caused any confusion or offense. It was not my intention to disrespect the traditions of this great country." The words felt heavy in his mouth. He had spent hours writing the statement, trying to sound both sincere and calm. He knew that the video of the incident had spread quickly, and the last thing he wanted was to make the situation worse. The reporters listened closely, their pens moving quickly over notepads. One reporter raised her hand. "Colonel Dawson," she said, "do you think this incident will affect your relationship with the British government?" Eric paused for a moment before answering. "No," he said firmly. "I believe that this situation is an isolated incident, and it will not harm the strong relationship between our countries. We are committed to working together for the benefit of both our nations." The reporters nodded, and another one spoke up. "Do you understand why the Royal Guard did not salute you?" Eric hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain what he now understood. "Yes," he replied slowly. "The Royal Guards have a very specific role in British tradition. They follow rules that go beyond personal interactions. I now realize that my request was not appropriate in that context. I respect the customs of this country." With that, the press conference was over. Eric stepped away from the cameras and walked back to his office. His face was tired, but there was a sense of relief. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to move on. Back at the palace, the story was starting to die down. The British media had moved on to other stories, and the public's attention was no longer focused on the Royal Guard's silence. But for Eric, the lesson lingered. In the embassy, his staff was watching the press conference. Some of them nodded in approval. The apology had been well handled, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. Eric knew that he had done the right thing, but he couldn't help but feel a little humbled by the whole experience. That afternoon, Eric decided to visit Buckingham Palace again. He wanted to see the guards once more, to truly understand what had happened the day before. He stood outside the gates, watching as the guards marched back and forth. This time, he didn't approach them. He simply observed, letting the quiet strength of their presence speak for itself. As he watched, Eric thought about how different cultures had their own ways of showing respect. The silence of the guard had been a reminder that there was more to diplomacy than rank and rules. It was about understanding and adapting. Eric left the palace quietly, feeling a sense of peace. The situation wasn't completely behind him, but he knew he had learned something important. And in the world of international relations, sometimes that was enough. The days following the press conference felt quieter. The media had mostly moved on from the incident, and the British public had returned to their usual routines. However, for Colonel Eric Dawson, the events of the past week continued to linger in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the silent guard standing still at the gates of Buckingham Palace, and he found himself reflecting on the lesson he had learned. One afternoon, Eric sat in his office, reviewing documents and preparing for upcoming meetings. His thoughts kept drifting back to the Royal Guards. He had visited the palace again a few times since the incident, but this time, he didn't want to just observe. He wanted to understand. He decided to ask his colleague Martin about the Royal Guard's role. Martin, who had lived in London for years, knew the city's customs well. Eric figured he might have some answers that could help him make sense of it all. "Martin," Eric began, looking up from his desk, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the palace. Can you explain a bit more about the Royal Guard's role?" Martin looked up from his own papers, clearly surprised by the question. He put down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said slowly, "the guards at Buckingham Palace are part of a long-standing tradition. They are symbols of the monarchy and British history. They aren't there to respond to anyone personally. Their job is to stand watch, to protect the palace, and to maintain the dignity of the crown." "So they don't salute unless it's a formal occasion?" Eric asked. "Exactly," Martin replied. "They follow strict rules. A salute is only given during official ceremonies or if the Queen herself gives the order. Otherwise, they remain still, no matter who's watching." Eric nodded thoughtfully. The more he learned, the more he understood why his request had been out of place. The Royal Guards weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of something much bigger. Their silence wasn't a refusal to show respect. It was a demonstration of their duty and the values they represented. After their conversation, Eric found himself looking at the situation in a new light. It wasn't about personal respect or rank. It was about honoring a centuries-old tradition that held meaning far beyond a single interaction. The silence of the guard had been powerful, not because it was a refusal, but because it was a statement of commitment to something larger than themselves. Later that week, Eric visited the palace again. This time, he stood quietly at the gates, observing the guards from a distance. He didn't approach them. He didn't ask for a salute. He simply watched, feeling a deep sense of respect for the role they played. As he stood there, Eric realized something. In international diplomacy, understanding the customs and traditions of other cultures was just as important as understanding their politics or economics. It wasn't always about what he expected. Sometimes it was about learning to see the world through someone else's eyes. And in that moment, Eric felt a quiet sense of peace. He had learned more than he could have imagined from a single silent guard. A few weeks had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and things seemed to be returning to normal at the embassy. Colonel Eric Dawson's apology had been well received, and the media had moved on to other stories. But while the outside world had largely forgotten about the moment, Eric continued to reflect on it, and he began to notice changes within himself. One morning, Eric was sitting in a small cafe near the embassy, enjoying a quiet cup of coffee. The place was cozy, with warm yellow lights and the soft hum of conversations. Eric had come here many times before, but today he felt different. He was no longer just a foreign officer focused on rank and duty. The events at Buckingham Palace had opened his eyes to something more important: understanding and respect for other cultures. As he sat, he couldn't help but overhear a conversation at the table next to him. Two tourists were speaking about their visit to London and the Royal Guards. One of them mentioned the famous changing of the guards ceremony, where soldiers march in perfect unison, and how the guards stood perfectly still while tourists snapped pictures. The other person laughed and said, "It's funny how they don't move at all, even when people try to get their attention." Eric smiled quietly to himself. It was amusing to hear the tourist talk about something that had caused him so much frustration only a few weeks earlier. But now he understood. The silence of the guards wasn't a joke or a challenge. It was a tradition. And as odd as it seemed to some people, it was a powerful one. The more Eric thought about it, the more he realized how much he had learned from that single moment of silence. It wasn't just about the Royal Guard or Buckingham Palace. It was about the importance of respecting different customs, even when they were unfamiliar or uncomfortable. In diplomacy, there were no shortcuts to understanding. It took time and effort to learn the deeper meanings behind actions and traditions. Back at the embassy, Eric found himself in a meeting with his colleagues. The atmosphere was focused, and they were discussing their next steps in strengthening ties between their countries. Eric spoke up, but this time his tone was more thoughtful. He had a new perspective on the importance of respect in international relations. "It's not just about following the rules," Eric said, looking around the room. "It's about understanding why those rules exist in the first place. Every culture has its traditions, and we have to learn to respect them, even when they seem." Weeks passed, and the memory of the incident at Buckingham Palace began to fade. The Royal Guards had returned to their usual duties, and Colonel Eric Dawson had settled back into his work at the embassy. Yet something had changed within him. His perspective on diplomacy, respect, and cultural differences had deepened. He had learned valuable lessons, ones that would shape his actions moving forward. One morning, Eric received a call from his superior, the ambassador. "Colonel Dawson," the ambassador began, "I have an important assignment for you. We've been invited to a diplomatic event in another country. It's a chance for us to strengthen relations, but we need to be cautious. The local customs are very different from what we're used to." Eric listened carefully, his mind already working. "What kind of customs are we talking about?" he asked. "Well," the ambassador explained, "there are certain rituals and traditions that we need to respect. We've had issues in the past with foreign guests who didn't understand the importance of these customs, and it caused some tension. I'm asking you to handle this visit with the utmost care. We don't want any misunderstandings." Eric felt a sense of responsibility. The recent experience at Buckingham Palace had shown him how easy it was to overlook cultural differences. He knew that this new assignment would require even more sensitivity. "Understood, sir. I'll make sure we're fully prepared." Over the next few days, Eric worked closely with his team to learn about the customs and traditions of the country they would be visiting. They studied the history, the culture, and the social norms. Eric even consulted with local experts to make sure they understood every detail. When the day of the diplomatic event arrived, Eric felt ready. The plane landed in the foreign country, and the team was greeted warmly by their hosts. The atmosphere was different from what Eric was used to. The people had a sense of pride in their traditions, and it was clear that these customs were not to be taken lightly. As they entered the venue, Eric noticed a large group of local officials, each wearing traditional clothing. The way they carried themselves, the way they spoke, it was all a reflection of their culture's values. Eric felt a sense of respect for them, understanding that their way of life was deeply important to them. The event itself was formal and elegant. There were specific rituals that had to be followed, such as a moment of silence before the speeches began, and certain gestures that symbolized respect. Eric made sure to pay close attention to every detail. He knew that his actions would reflect not only on him, but on his country as well. Throughout the evening, Eric found himself admiring how well the customs were integrated into the fabric of the country. It wasn't just about rules, it was about honoring history, people, and the values that held the community together. Eric was no longer just going through the motions. He understood now that every tradition, every custom, had a purpose. As the event came to a close, Eric felt a sense of accomplishment. There had been no misunderstandings, no mistakes. The evening had been a success, and he had navigated the situation with respect and understanding. He had learned to honor not only the traditions of others, but also the deeper meanings behind them. When Eric returned to his hotel room later that night, he reflected on how much he had grown. His journey had come full circle, from the silent guard at Buckingham Palace to this diplomatic event. He realized that, just like the guard's silence, every tradition had its own power, a power that could bring people together, if only they were willing to listen and learn. Months had passed since the diplomatic event, and Colonel Eric Dawson felt that his understanding of international relations had transformed. The lessons he had learned from the royal guard at Buckingham Palace, as well as from the customs of the foreign country he had visited, had deeply influenced his approach to his work. He had grown into a more patient, thoughtful leader who saw diplomacy not just as a matter of politics, but as a way of bridging cultures and understanding different perspectives. One morning, Eric sat at his desk in the embassy, reviewing reports and preparing for an upcoming meeting with foreign dignitaries. Though he was busy with his duties, his mind often drifted back to the lessons he had learned. The guard's silence, the careful respect required during diplomatic events. It all seemed to come together, a puzzle he was now able to see with clearer eyes. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Martin, his trusted colleague, stepped inside, holding a letter. "Colonel," he said, "we've received another invitation, this time from the British government. They've invited us to an official ceremony at Buckingham Palace." Eric raised an eyebrow, surprised. It had been some time since his last visit to the palace. Did they have a specific request? Martin nodded. "It's a formal gathering. They'd like to discuss future cooperation between our countries. But they also mentioned something about the traditions at the palace. They want to make sure we're aware of how things are done." Eric smiled slightly. He understood the importance of tradition now. "I think we'll be just fine," he said, feeling a quiet sense of confidence. He knew that his previous experiences had prepared him well for moments like this. As the day of the ceremony approached, Eric and his team made sure to carefully review everything. They studied the customs once again, making sure they were fully prepared. Eric even took the time to visit Buckingham Palace once more, walking along the gates and observing the guards as they stood their watch. He still felt a sense of awe and respect whenever he saw them, standing tall and silent, embodying a tradition that had endured for centuries. On the day of the ceremony, Eric arrived at the palace feeling calm and ready. As he entered the grand hall, he was greeted by familiar faces, officials from both the British government and his own. Everything was as formal as he had expected, but there was also a warmth in the air, a mutual respect that filled the room. The ceremony itself went smoothly. Eric stood alongside his colleagues, listening carefully to the speeches, paying attention to every gesture and word. He knew that each part of the event had meaning, and he was eager to respect the traditions that had shaped the gathering. When it was his turn to speak, Eric stood confidently before the guests. "It is an honor to be here today," he began, his voice steady. "I have come to deeply appreciate the traditions that bind our nations together. As we continue to build our relationship, it is important to recognize and respect the values that define us." The room was quiet as he spoke, and Eric felt a sense of connection with everyone there. He realized that diplomacy was not just about policies or agreements. It was about understanding, respecting, and honoring what each culture held dear. As the ceremony concluded, Eric stepped outside into the fresh air, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The lessons from his past had guided him well, and he knew that the future would hold many more opportunities to learn and grow. With every new challenge, he had become a better diplomat, a better leader, and he had learned that sometimes the greatest strength in diplomacy came from silence, understanding, and respect.